like to thank all three of you for really engaging presentations of what are going to be some of the issues I'm sure we discuss throughout these 2 days, if not merely in the next 45 minutes of discussion time we have allotted. I think I'll throw out a general question or two to the panelists first, and to see if everyone wants to respond to it, and then we'll open up to the discussion to everybody. So don't be bashful about raising your hands whenever, and I'll start pulling you in. This may be too big a thing to begin with, but I do think, Kate's last point, what does the literary mean to us, and how do we convey that to an outside world, not only the non-academic world, but even within our own institutions, so that we have that support structure within our administrations, is a huge one. And I would invite further speculation from the speakers. As well as, related to that, the question of, can we rethink profitability? That seems a key word in terms of an era of academic budget cuts right and left. Can we transform that meaning away from the dollar sign into a different sense of educatability of what it means to engage in texts, both literary and cultural? So more speculations about how you see us as literary and cultural critics making a case for what we do to that administrator who's deciding whether or not to downsize your department.
I want to refuse the concept of outside and inside.
Okay.
Here. I think it's one audience. I think it's one conversation. I think it's one set of persuasions. I don't think we ought to talk one way to our graduate students or our undergraduates, and another way to our colleagues, and another way to our administrators, and another way to the press. That's the problem. Mm-hmm. The problem is that we need to make the importance of what we do clear at every level, and the way to do that is to do it. And to invite that hypothetical administrator to come to a class or to read a book or to see what work is being done, to try, and at the same time, I think, and several of us have talked about this on other occasions, to try to equip our graduate students and emerging younger scholars with the capacity when they write fellowship applications, for example, to take that next step and to explain so what and why it matters, why this inquiry in literary studies has an effect or makes a difference, or in what conversation it participates. That's something that some scholars in other fields take for granted, or that the fields themselves have a kind of tacit importance, like certain kinds of history. Mm-hmm. And of course, you've got to fill in those 5 years in the Mongol Empire. But for us, somehow, we need to explain, and we need to learn how to do this ourselves. Nobody's going to show us how to do this. This is part of our job as teachers, as scholars, as writers. It's not different from what we do, it's what we do. Mm-hmm.
I still think that there are different audiences, however, in the sense that many people have different starting places. Within one's own institution, the kind of justification that's necessary might well be, well, how do you speak to other people within this institution? Which is where something like talking about reading methods and methods of understanding and comprehending that involve the neurobiologists just as much as they involve the literary scholars can be extremely useful, because I think that within an institution there is far more ground to be gained by thinking of ourselves as a kind of an intellectual whole. And this is where I think interdisciplinarity, as well as being trendy, is very often a very good tool through which to talk to the administration. Many people who do not work within the university are going to come at literature through saying, did you see that adaptation of Emma on Masterpiece Theatre? Mm-hmm. And this is what turns them on, and this is what they are excited about. I agree that there is that overlap between trying to get those people to think about their experience and their world and what goes on within our self-enclosed world. You're trying to open up all the time. But to talk only on the grounds of the enjoyment and the pleasure of texts, however important those are, is also okay, let me finish though. It's also the way of reinforcing the ideas of some people within the institution that we're only concerned with the leisure, the enjoyment, the absorption when it comes to reading. And I think that we need to convince everybody that whether you're reading Emma or you're reading a much more abstruse and difficult on the surface text, that reading is about thinking and analysing the world in general.
I agree that you have to talk differently to different audiences, and another thing, I wonder how many of us here have been involved in trying to write a mission statement for a department. I have several times in several departments been involved in writing a mission statement, and for the last 10 or 15 years at least, it has been a very, very difficult exercise. And the reason it's been so difficult is that there is so little agreement, even within the department, about what it is that we're doing. Within a department now, not everybody would agree that what we're all about is language. UK, we're talking about literary and cultural studies, which is very, very much to the point. A lot of what is being done in English departments now is, in fact, cultural studies. So the case has to be made for both literary and cultural studies, and they are not the same thing. They are not the same thing for us, and they are certainly not the same thing for the person who is in love with the masterpiece theater production of Emma. Cultural studies is much harder to explain to an external audience, and these mission statements, which get increasingly vague and bland, I've read a lot of other mission statements too, point to the fact that when we try to justify, well, not to justify, just to explain what it is that we're doing, we tend to explain what we personally are doing, what we and our graduate students are doing, but not what the whole enterprise is, and people are confused about the enterprise.
Marge, did you want to weigh in?
Well, I do both literary studies and cultural studies. I've done them my entire career. I think that they are linked by their interest in analysis, and I would say that it's not, I mean, that the pleasure I would take for granted is the wrong thing to say, but we're not teaching pleasure. We're teaching analysis. We're teaching reading. We're teaching interpretation. We're teaching what interpretation means and why it matters, and why it is possible to interpret something, and why it's possible to come out with several different arguments, each of which could be based upon literary evidence, whatever, or textual evidence, if you like, that could be quite different arguments that could be sustained by the evidence that we use. This question of evidence is maybe most central to how we're trying to explain what it is that we do. What is evidence in literary study? What counts as evidence? Not, I get the feeling that, or Richard III strikes me as a mean man, or something like that, but where in the text do you find your evidence? And depends, I mean, the text could be any set of things that you are reading, including obviously visual texts. But I'm plainly, a mission statement is not going to be the same as an op-ed piece of the New York Times. It's not going to be the same as an undergraduate class. But our job as department chairs, as writers, as mission statements, is to understand the point of view of other people in our department, to try to give it the voice that it needs, and to ask them how to explain what it is that we shouldn't be writing them only from our point of view, because then we ourselves underestimate the breadth of the capacity of our colleagues.